this is Public TV of Armenia. Today I will discuss the current situation in Caucasus and Middle East, Turkey's behavior in Syria and other regions, as well as Azerbaijan's continuous rhetoric with Michael Rubin, resident scholar at American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Rubin, thank you very much for your time and coming.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back in Armenia.
You participated in an event in Yerevan on human rights and consequences of war. What was your contribution to the event, and how important are these kind of events for the awareness raising on human rights and war crimes among the international community?
Well, I had given a talk at this conference from the Center for Truth and Justice with regard to the U.S. policy towards the Caucasus and some of the problems which we still face when it comes to Turkey, when it comes to Armenia, when it comes to Azerbaijan, and specifically when it comes to the failure of the international community to truly recognize the genocidal ideology which is at the heart of Turkey and Azerbaijan's behavior. You know, I'm cynical about most conferences, but this one is the exception, because what the organizers have done is bring together a number of practitioners and not simply give the same speech over and over again, but combine the technical information and gathering with regard to war crimes with the general policy issues. We're talking about Turkish drones, we're talking about the POWs, we're talking about any sorts of things. It's truly a valuable conference.
Azerbaijan now constantly violates the obligations it took of November 9 announcement. As you know, there are several. Still, there are Armenian POWs in that country, and also Aliyev states that they want a corridor through Armenian territory, which also contradicts the obligations and agreement. Worth to mention also the demolition of Armenian heritage in occupied territories of Artsakh. What does Aliyev and Azerbaijan want to achieve after almost 2 years past after the end of the war, 44-day war?
Well, Azerbaijan wants to be in a perpetual state of crisis with regard to Armenia. When you look at per capita GDP, even though Azerbaijan has fantastic oil wealth, Armenians, according to the World Bank, Armenia's per capita GDP is actually higher, which is just a testament to how corrupt the Azeri regime has become. The Azeri people recognize this, and so Aliyev uses his conflict with Armenia as a distraction. The problem we have in the West is too often we're looking at this conflict in terms of grievance with regard to some of the land disputes, border disputes, when in reality, this dispute and Azerbaijan's behavior is motivated by ideology, and that's a lot harder to solve. It's impossible to understand why Azerbaijan and Turkey are acting the way they act unless you understand the history of the Armenian genocide and the fact that the 44-day war began on the 100th anniversary of the Ottoman invasion of independent Armenia.
But what do you think, don't the politicians in Washington and in the West in general understand the real and realities of Armenian genocide, and as you mentioned, the history of Armenian, which also consequences of the war nowadays?
Well, two things. First of all, there's been progress, and of course we saw President Joe Biden recognize the Armenian genocide. But there's also an attitude in Washington that takes a transactional approach. So on one hand, we recognize the Armenian genocide, and then 2 days later, we waive Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act, which essentially gives Azerbaijan military aid. Now you've got a situation where that simply shows that there isn't a true understanding of the depth. There's a confusion that quiet sometimes means peace when that's not the case. And there's a great deal of wishful thinking, but to gear policy towards wishful thinking can be very, very, very dangerous indeed when you have a regime such as in Baku, which has fantastic oil wealth and a genocidal ideology. When you combine that together, it's a recipe for future disaster.
Coming to the ongoing processes between Armenia and Azerbaijan, how would you assess this process after the several trilateral meetings between Armenian, Azerbaijani leaders and Charles Michel and also the president of Russia in Brussels, in Moscow, and the first meeting of border commission between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and taking into account also that US, EU and Russia support this process?
Well, on one hand, we support this process and we will pay lip service to this notion that the process has to be resolved diplomatically, but call me cynical for two reasons. First of all, I don't believe that Azerbaijan truly anymore is an independent country. In order to pursue his war against Artsakh and his incursions across the recognized border of Armenia, what Aliyev has done is essentially sell out Azeri sovereignty to both Russia and Turkey. And so really, when I want to look at the future direction of where this is going, I'll look at what Turkey is signaling, because Aliyev is basically the second fiddle, the poodle to Erdogan at this point. And I don't believe that Erdogan is sincere for the same reasons I don't believe Aliyev is sincere, because they're using the conflict and the perpetuation of the conflict to cover up the fact that they've ruined their economies. They want to distract the public. Now, what I see both Aliyev and Erdogan doing is trying to assuage the West so that they don't have to be accountable for what they've done, for continuing to hold at least 38 POWs and committing war crimes, which have been documented on video. They want to have relief from that sort of accountability. At the same time, ultimately, I don't think they're willing to take the decision to end their conflict with Armenia on peaceful and honest terms, simply because they're motivated by ideology rather than simply a territorial grievance.
Okay. The military operations in Ukraine created an unprecedented tensions in the region and globally, and which also impacted politics. Unfortunately, it also had negative impact on our region, the Caucasus. As you must most probably know, today we can hardly talk about the unanimous work of OSCE Minsk group. What would you think about the impact could have, which could have the highlighted competition among the co-chair countries on the solution of urgent issues in the Caucasus, namely the Nagorno-Karabakh issue?
Well, you know, I share your frustration. I share Armenia's frustration with regard to the ineffectiveness of the Minsk group. And certainly we saw after the 44-day war, Andrew Shofer go to Baku, and Aliyev humiliated him in front of the cameras. Now, Andrew Shofer is a good man, but he didn't have the support of Washington to the extent he should have, because Washington was distracted during the 44-day war with our looming elections, and more recently we've been distracted with Ukraine. It will be interesting to see who gets appointed, since Andrew Shofer is now rotating on to his next assignment. That said, what I worry about is Aliyev is a master of recognizing how he can distract the West. And I mean, we have that with Ukraine now. And so I think this is why I always counsel Washington, don't confuse quiet with peace, because it's clear when we look at the continual holding of the POWs, when we look at the genocidal rhetoric, the claims that all of Armenia's territory is actually historically Azeri, which is false. When it comes to the twisting of history with regard to the demography of Artsakh, when it comes to the cultural genocide, the cultural eradication that has been ongoing in Shushi and elsewhere, it's clear that he's not sincere. And you know, Armenia has every right to be upset with the international community at this point, simply because it's clear that the Minsk group hasn't been effective in its duty. This is also the reason why it's unacceptable that the US has in the past waived Section 907, because it's not just an affront to Armenia and the facts of what went on in Nagorno-Karabakh. It's an assault on the US Congress, because the law is clear. If Azerbaijan hasn't forsworn its military policy, then it deserves no American aid. And yet, we've waived it for transactional reasons. As far as I'm concerned, that's a violation of US law, and that's something which the US Congress should be pursuing against the executive branch.
Armenia also started a dialogue with Turkey, as you know, and both countries appointed special representatives for the dialogue or negotiations, as different people call. They already had 3 meetings. And overall, what does this process give, what do you think, to both sides?
I trust Armenia wants peace. And you know, Armenia has never attacked Turkey. Turkey's blockade on Armenia has been illegal. I mean, Armenia has shown through its actions that it wants peace, it wants normalization, it wants an end to this blockade. What does Turkey want? Erdogan is heading into elections next year. Now, I don't think that Erdogan is ever going to accept the outcome of a truly democratic election. I predict that there will be some sort of crisis which Erdogan will use to cancel or postpone elections if it becomes clear that he'll lose them or he can't even manipulate the results with fraud. Now, what Erdogan wants is to avoid suffering the consequences for his action. He wants to pretend that he's being productive with regard to diplomacy so that no one sanctions him further, especially given the weakness of the Turkish economy. He has no one to blame but himself because for 20 years he has had dictatorial control over that country, and the blame stops with him. The Turks now recognize it. So he's negotiating insincerely. We need to recognize that for Armenia, diplomacy is about peace. For Turkey, diplomacy is an asymmetric warfare strategy.
Can we say that you are very much concerned about the Turkish attitude and approach towards these negotiations and normalization process?
Yes, absolutely. And Erdogan is someone who has shown repeatedly that he's motivated by ideology. He's not sincere. Tactically, he'll feign rapprochement with Israel, with Greece, with Armenia, but then he'll shred that when it becomes convenient for him. And unfortunately, he will try to use conflict to distract the Turkish public. What worries me more, however, is again, there's wishful thinking in the United States and in Europe that the problem is just Erdogan. But when you consider that he's been in power for 20 years now, you've had more than 25 million Turks educated under Erdogan. They have essentially been brainwashed. At the same time, if you joined the Turkish military on the day that Recep Tayyip Erdogan became prime minister, as a private, today you might be a lieutenant colonel or a colonel. So essentially, he's shaped the entire Turkish military in his image. If there was hope in the past under someone like Turgut Özal, that's gone. It's going to be a generational problem we're facing inside with Turkey.
So continuing with Turkey, as you know, Turkey announced a new military operations in Syria. And as they say, against terrorists, which is Kurdish militia, as they call the terrorists. And considering that the Kurds have large support from US, what do you think, what impact would this new operation have on Turkey-US relations?
Well, first of all, I'm a frequent visitor to northeast Syria. And when you actually look at the statistics, the number of attacks from Syria into Turkey is negligible. When you look at the attacks from Turkey into Syria, there's hundreds. When I was visiting with the United Nations in Sinjar, which is actually on the Iraqi side of the border, we were warned that we had to be back before dark because the Turkish jets would even bomb the UN convoys. Now, the Turks say that the Syrian Kurds are terrorists, but I don't know too many 6-year-old terrorists. And that's exactly who the Syrians, what the Turkish F-16s and drones are attacking. Now, if we look at precedent, back in around 2018, Turkey used the same excuse to go into the Afrin district of northern Syria. Now, if we look at Afrin today, they've dug up graveyards, they've eradicated the Kurdish heritage, just like they eradicate the Armenian heritage in Artsakh, parts of occupied Artsakh. They've even opened Turkish domestic post offices. They're essentially creating in northern Syria what they've done in northern Cyprus. They're not content to live within their own borders, which is why we need to be very worried, especially when Recep Tayyip Erdogan questions the legitimacy of the Lausanne Treaty.
And also, they as I know, opened many schools in Afrin to kind of educate young people.
They've done that. They have refused to issue identification cards to those with Kurdish names. They've refused to issue identification cards to women who refuse to wear the Muslim Brotherhood style veil. So there's a religious component to this as well. Even though the Kurds are Muslim, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is a very strict, conservative, narrow-minded sort of Muslim, which is even foreign traditionally to Anatolian Sufism. So you've got a situation where there really is, in fact and spirit, an ethnic and a cultural cleansing going on, and I'm afraid that the green light that Turkey seems to believe it has because the Biden administration has agreed or has endorsed providing new F-16 jets to Turkey, is being seen as a reason to continue the ethnic cleansing. Now, Turkey says they only want to go 30 kilometers down into Syria, but when you actually look at the map, that's where Kobane was, where the Kurdish forces broke the siege from the Islamic State. That's where most of the population is. So what we're really talking about is a whole-scale ethnic cleansing. They're sending the Kurds into the deserts of Syria, into the Deir ez-Zor area, just like during the genocide they sent the Armenians.
Yeah, 100 years ago,
yes.
They did it with Armenians. Turkey also has tense relations with Greece, as you mentioned, and also the Persian Gulf countries, Arab countries. Although there are some steps taken recently for normalizing the relations with the Arab world, what do you think, what perspectives do you see and in the developments of this situation with Greece, Mediterranean countries, and also Arab world?
What we see is Erdogan, who in the past feigned an effort for rapprochement with Greece, suddenly is saying he's not even going to sit down with the Greek prime minister anymore. He was furious that the Greek prime minister, during his recent trip to Washington, got a standing ovation before a joint session of Congress. The fact of the matter is that we see an aggression, and it's almost as if Erdogan rotates. He probes to see where there's going to be pushback, and he rotates where he's going to be aggressive in order to, again, avoid accountability, because the West too often falls into this trap where we don't want to undermine peace efforts somewhere else, and so we'll give Turkey a free pass. The other problem in the Eastern Mediterranean is that small countries like Cyprus are oftentimes forced or pressured to give concessions by Europe when they want to get Turkish buy-in somewhere else, for example, with regard to sanctions on Belarus. And so the fact of the matter is that small countries like Cyprus, like Armenia, need to be worried about people thousands of kilometers away in foreign ministries trying to strike deals naively with Erdogan, not understanding that the whole reason why Erdogan creates the crisis in the first place is to extract concessions from them.
Mr. Rubin, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
This is Public TV of Armenia, and today has discussed current situation in Caucasus, Middle East, Turkey's behavior in Syria and other regions with Mr. Michael Rubin, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for watching us.